slightly different angle, but my messed up foot started to do its pain thing. So I had to get off of it. On to series 2. So this one is the Lone Star Heroes. Is that what Lone Star Heroes? I think that's what she's calling this series. These all take place in or around Texas, mostly post-Civil War, but it does talk a little bit about the Civil War years with some of the characters. So the first book is The Loyal Heart, and if I remember right, I don't think the women in these stories overlap that much. I think the men, because all the men that are talked about in this series, they're all part of the same troop, I think. So they'll show up in all these different stories, but their female counterparts, I don't think they overlap as much. Still, I, again, would probably recommend reading this in order. I don't think it's quite as necessary with this one as with the Chicago World Fair mysteries, but I think just keeping track of the stories, because basically what happens with these is you have this troop of guys that all served together during the Civil War, and each book follows a different guy in the troop or focuses on him, and you get a little piece of what happened to all of them from one guy or another. So it just, I think if you read them in order, it just kind of helps to build that backstory a little bit easier than if you just pick them up wherever. One of the key elements that's brought up in all of these books is all the guys, they serve together, and then they're all brought together at this POW camp during the Civil War. And even though the majority of these stories take place post-Civil War, I think they all open with the POW scenes, if I remember right. Yeah, you get these, let's see if I can, you get these chapter headings that tell you Johnson's Island, Ohio, Confederate States of America officers, POW camp, January 1865. So these pop up every few chapters, where you get a little bit more of a piece of the story as far as like what went down in that POW camp, and then the rest of the story is post-war experience. So the first one is The Loyal Heart, and then book 2 is then Uncommon Protector, and then book 3 is the cringe title for me, Love Held Captive. I really hate that title, but I'll get into that in a minute. Okay, so starting with book 1, The Loyal Heart. Again, this is a series that I read a little while ago, so let me look back on my notes here and remind myself what all went down. Okay, book 1, 3 years after the close of the Civil War, Miranda, I think her name was, yeah, Miranda Markham. She was widowed during the war. Sorry, I'm due for a haircut again, and I have the like side bangs that keep wanting to move into my face. It's driving me crazy. I'm gonna get it taken care of pretty soon. But Miranda Markham lost her husband in the war, and since then she's going through what a lot of war widows went through, where she's just trying to figure out how she's gonna pay the bills as a single woman now. She doesn't really have any prospects on the horizon. Nobody popped up and said, I'll take care of you. So she gets the idea to take her home, or her husband's home, and turn it into a bed and breakfast. And is that what she's calling it? Bed and breakfast? Or boarding house, that kind of thing. She calls it the Iron Rail, and puts word out that she's taking boarders. But she has a little bit of difficulty, because it turns out that there was a rumor going around that her husband, Philip, I think his name was, might have been a traitor to the country and might have been selling war secrets to the other side. And even though he's dead, she's still held guilty by association. The people in town they start making rumors about her, saying that, oh, well, you know, the Iron Rail, as she says, it's a boarding house, but it's probably just a cover for something more illicit. And so basically, her neighbors are just making it hell for her to make an income. So Robert Truax, he's one of the guys in the Confederate Army crew that gets featured in this series. He comes into town and comes in as a boarder, stays at the Iron Rail, and gets to know her a little bit, and then it dawns on him who she is. He didn't pick up on it at first, I don't think, but then he comes forward and says, well, I actually knew your husband during the war. We served together. And then he reveals that, not uncommon for soldiers during any war, from what I read, there was an agreement that said if one of them didn't get back home, the others would go back and make sure their women folk were taken care of, basically. So it's, like I said, it's been 3 years after the war, but Robert's like, sorry it took me so long. But hey, I'll still keep my promise though. I'll, you know, make sure you're taken care of. And he's, in the beginning, he's not saying like he's going to marry her and take care of all her bills or everything. He's basically just saying, you know, I'll stick around and help you out, whatever you need me to do until you're on your feet again. And of course, there's a criminal element that gets worked in the story, so Robert Truax has to come in and be the sort of security for Miranda. That largely covers the premise of the first book. It's basically Robert being there to help Miranda and help her fight her battles, and in the process he also gets sort of taken with the classic combination of beauty, strength, and vulnerability that gets worked into a lot of books. And I know a lot of this is sounding sort of trite and cliche, and I will say that this storyline, at least in my experience, has been worked to death as far as the grieving widow and the friend that comes in and makes it all better and then ends up falling for her himself. But I will say that there is something to Gray's writing, that she does successfully put her own spin on it. She does make it interesting in her own way. So it did, like, I could recognize it as something I've read a million times before, but in this case it didn't irritate me. I was still very much entertained by the story. There's also a mystery worked in as far as, you know, in the beginning, it's one of those books where the writer, Gray, throws doubt on the story so that the reader doesn't really know which way it's going to go. So in the beginning you're introduced to the whole Philip scandal as far as him possibly being a traitor. You're given that at first as, oh, this is just a rumor started in town, but then later there are things that are worked into the story where you're like, okay, so is there truth to the story? And then it's flipped again to where it says, well, maybe it was a misunderstanding. So that keeps you reading, which I appreciated. That she incorporates this mystery enough to where you're not quite sure what the truth is until you get to the end. One thing I noted in my notes for the first book is when Thomas Nelson first sent me this series, it had been a while since I had finished the Chicago World Fair series, so I didn't initially put it together that this was the same author. But when I was reading this first one, there was something about it where I'm like, I feel like I've seen this scene before somewhere. And it kept happening multiple times in this book. I was like, I feel like I've seen this somewhere before. And I was sitting there reading, and then I did one of those things where I looked up and I was scanning my shelves, and I just happened to hit the World Fair books. And I was like, oh my gosh, the same person. And then it dawned on me, because those books started running, the plots from the World Fair books started running through my head, and then I started making connections where I realized Gray might have been pulling from that first series and using it as inspiration to write some of these scenes in the Civil War series. Because I noticed, I made a note in here, it said the conversations between Belle and Sheriff Kern in The Loyal Heart echoes conversations between Katie Ryan and Detective Ryan. I want to say Katie Ryan was Detective Ryan's sister in the Chicago book. Yeah, Deception on Sable Hill. Echoes conversations between the Ryans in Deception on Sable Hill. Then also there's a parlor scene in this book between Viola and Ruth Markham, who are Miranda's in-laws, and Robert Truax and Captain Monroe, who is a character that comes up again in the later books. And the way that scene goes down mirrored scenes that happen in Secrets of Sloane House. Again, this book here, the Chicago book. Also in this book, at one point, there's a kidnapping scene, which the way it plays out is pretty similar to a kidnapping scene that happens in the Sloane House book. So, yeah, I just thought that was kind of funny, or I was like, oh, yeah, look at her pulling from her old stuff. Another thing I noted is this one, The Loyal Heart, it runs darker than I expected. Again, the topics of depression are brought up, PTSD. I think one or both of the characters, Miranda and Robert, discuss having suicidal thoughts at one point or another. And then there was also a revelation that Miranda makes in here that I found pretty moving, where she talks about the very last moments she recalls having with her husband before he went off to the war and eventually got killed. And one thing I really appreciated with that scene is how real and raw it felt, because in movies, when you have that depiction of the soldier going off to war, you have the wives that are very weepy and no, and then, or they're trying to be the very strong and stoic, but then they break down later. But they always, in the movie, they always play it as it's a perfectly happy marriage, and they're just crushed to have their best friend going away. And I liked that in this story, Gray put a little bit more of a realistic spin on it and said there were issues between this couple that the war didn't wait for, but they were a married couple who had things they had to work on. And Miranda talks about that when she's telling Robert her final memories of her husband, and she's sharing the guilt of, you know, the few days she had before he was going off. And you know, I said that the war doesn't wait for your problems, but also, you know, you also have to live your life. You know, problems are going to happen when they happen. And Miranda's very honest about how there were certain feelings she had and certain unresolved problems and things that she wanted worked out, but also she feels guilty about feeling that way. So I don't know, I just like the realistic approach of it not being perfectly glossy and glowy and romantic and, you know, I'll be strong for you and all that. Which, I mean, I'm not saying that that's not an aspect, but I don't know, I could have respect for Gray coming at it from a different approach and saying, you know, there are probably some people that they have problems that never get worked out because they expect, oh, well, we're going to resume this when I come back. And then that opportunity doesn't happen. And then the other person has to live with that for the rest of their life. So there's like a lot of honest topics that were brought up in this one that I didn't expect, but I ended up appreciating later. So that was book one. And then from there you go into An Uncommon Protector, which has to do with Laurel Tracy, who loses her father and her brother during the Civil War, and then there's a little bit of a misprint on the back. It says she immediately loses her mother right after they get the news, basically. It's how did they word it? Both her brother and her father die in battle, and her mother passes away shortly after receiving word of their demise. Didn't exactly work like that in the book. They go on to, I mean, the mother doesn't play a huge figure in this, so I figure it's not that bad a spoiler. She's only mentioned in like the first couple chapters to establish lineage, I guess. But when she's mentioned, it's said that, yeah, she gets news and she's sad, but she also ends up remarrying like a year later, and then goes on to live with her second husband a full 3 more years before they're both taken by influenza. So it's not exactly passing away shortly after getting the news, and that's a full 4 years. So yeah, just a little hiccup on the back there. But in the end, Laurel ends up losing all of her immediate family, and she's left with the family farm. And it's a lot for one woman to take care of. I think they said it's 200 acres. And what is his name? Thomas Baker. He's a former soldier who comes in as a prisoner now. He comes in to do like with the as part of a full crew of prisoners. He comes in to do a little bit of work on her farm, and she gets the idea. I think they're there for, I mean, I think they like leave and come back for a few days or something. And I want to say they were like working on a fence or something like that. But over this time, she gets to know Thomas a little bit, and then she ends up making the decision that, you know what, he seems like a good worker. I think I'm going to hire him. And so she goes about paying his bond off, so he is released from prison, and then they make the agreement that in order for him to pay off what she paid for him to be free, he has to live at the farm for a year for free and work for her for free, which, as you can imagine, the rest of the town is aghast because she hired a convict. But as it turns out, you know, there's a story to everything, and Thomas is not the real problem in this story. For some reason, there is somebody else, a mystery person. I'm not saying that to be vague. It's honestly described as a mystery person. He's not. Character is honestly described as an unidentified threat person. Terrorist, maybe you would call it. But the person is leaving threatening letters for Laurel and saying things in so many ways of leave town or else kind of thing. She's having her cattle murdered off. At one point there's even arson. And she doesn't really know why people are coming after her. But she has Thomas there, so she feels a little bit safer. And of course, he, like all the guys in these books, he starts to develop an attachment to her. Because she's, you know, this vulnerable woman all out in the countryside by herself. Well, I'll just go ahead and say now, if you are a woman in need of women doing it for themselves literature, this may not be your video. Well, I was going to say that might be unfair because that does come up a little bit more in the third book. But for this one, the first 2 books, it's a little bit more man rescuing girl kind of thing. So Thomas takes care of Laurel and ends up being her savior to this terrorist threat. But that's why it's called an uncommon protector, because she's turning to a former convict to help her out. I did note in my notes that the way Thomas is written, his dialogue and just the way Gray seems to describe how he carries himself and everything, I was expecting a guy fully in like maybe his early to mid 30s. Then she just busts out that he's only 22 at some point in the story. And I was like, 22? Like, I didn't know anybody that acted that much of a full-grown man, 22. So yeah, I thought that was kind of funny. But I don't know. I guess maybe it was a different time. she also writes Thomas in a very sort of endearing way when he shows his softer side, because he is supposed to be a country boy, but Gray gives him the characteristic that he's scared of chickens. So, picturing like a big burly country boy that's spooked by chickens is, I don't know, I find it entertaining. One thing I did note about this one is the romance for me got to be a bit much. It was a little bit heavy-handed, sappy in this one, but like I think there was one scene, I might have mentioned it in my written review, which I'll try to remember to link down below. But there was a scene where I think Laurel is getting shot at or something, and Thomas comes diving in and throws her to the ground. And instead of fearing for her life, being like, oh my God, do I have any bullets in me? What does she focus on? Oh, he's so muscular and he smells so nice. It's like, that's all she's talking about. And I'm just sitting there reading, like, girl, you're getting shot at. Maybe, like, save that for later. And there's just, I don't know. It's just the interaction between them at times in this particular coupling or story, it just got a little bit ridiculous for me. So that was book 2, and then the one I cringed so hard at earlier, Love Held Captive, book 3. The thing that cracks me up about this one is it had the worst title of the series, but it ended up being the best book. As far as like actual plot development and characters and all of that. This one gets a little bit darker even than the other two. Basically, this starts with the story of this girl, Lisbeth, who has a first meeting with what's his name? Major Ethan Kelly. And like I mentioned before, all of these guys all know each other from all 3 books. You see their names pop up back and forth. It's just like one book or another will focus on one character. But I had to think about this one because this one actually involves 2 characters at once and I keep wanting to get them mixed up. So Lisbeth meets Major Kelly during the war. I don't think they're like on a name basis when they first meet. What happens is I think when this happens, it's at one of the lower points of the war, or when the war is almost over and the troops are very low in supplies, and they're given orders to just go raid people's houses and find supplies that way to keep the troops alive in between battles. And Major Kelly is not a fan of this order, but it is what he's trained to do. So he goes to these houses and has to tell his men, take whatever you can find. But whenever he does that, secretly he always feels like shit because he knows everybody's trying to survive the war. It's not just the soldiers. Like, none of these people have any food. But it's either them or the troops die. So he goes to Lisbeth's house. But he goes in not knowing that she's already had people ransack her house a number of times. Her family has all been killed off, and by the time Major Kelly finds her, she's almost mute with I don't think it's really terror at that point. I think it's like shock of what happens to her, because when he finds her, she's been disfigured. She has a cut running down her face, and she's very disheveled looking, and she has that like 100-yard stare going on where she's just like not really acknowledging anything. She just like, do what you gotta do. And that's basically their interaction that first time. And then years later, they meet up again. And at this time, Lisbeth is working in her cousin's hotel. I think her cousin is married to the hotel owner, and then Lisbeth gets a job as a housekeeper there. Major Kelly comes in as a guest at the hotel, and I don't think he notices it first, but then he sees the scar, and he mentions that he's never forgotten the girl. He just didn't realize it was her at first. So he's always carried that guilt of the way he left her. So when he realizes it's her, he goes out of his way to say, you know, I want to help you. I want to make things better. I want to make up for what I did. And at first she's understandably a little spooked because she explains to the reader what all happened to her and why she's not real comfortable around dudes. And rightfully so when she tells you what happens. And so when she tells Major Kelly the full story, he becomes even more protective of her and goes to the point of offering marriage to make sure she stays safe. And she's kind of like, I'm flattered, but I really don't want your pity marriage. And he's like, no, I really love you though. And you know, part of me reading this is thinking like, do you though? Do you? Or is it guilt? Because it's been, at the point that he's proposing, I think it's been like a day or two. So even me as the reader, I'm like, So I know I said before that the relationships were developed realistically, and they are for the most part. There's just like a few scenes here and there where it doesn't entirely ring true, but Gray is pretty good for the most part about keeping it realistic. But so there's all this back and forth between Major Kelly and Lisbeth, and then at the same time, or I guess I should say simultaneously, there's also the story of Captain Devon. Is that her name? I think it's, yeah, Devon. Captain Devon Monroe, who gets acquainted with Julianne Van Fleet, who has been shunned by the town. She's just complete outcast. At first, Devon doesn't really take much mind of it, but then I think they get to talking about it at one point, and finally Julianne, she feels like the relationship might be drifting towards something serious, and so she's like, do you really want to know why they treat me that way? And so she has her own hard luck story about the war and some of the choices she had to make in order to feed her and her ailing grandmother. And when she lays out the full story in front of Devon, he's immediately very quick to judge her and be like, oh, how could you? Oh, it's terrible. I can't associate with you. I take everything I said back, and storms out. And she's seen this behavior a million times before, so she doesn't really think anything of it. She's disappointed because, you know, she just started opening up to somebody, but at the same time she's like, well, I guess I shouldn't have gotten my hopes up. But then Devon thinks on it, and he talks to other people about what he's feeling a little bit, and then he realizes that he was kind of a dick about the situation. He says, you know, there was a war going on. We all had to make choices we were not fans of, and we all had to make choices that we wouldn't do in any other circumstances just for the sake of survival. So he goes back to Julianne. I keep wanting to say Juliet. He goes back to Julianne and basically grovels and says, I'm sorry, I was kind of a shit about that. And I think she wants to take him back initially, but she's a little hurt because, you know, he was talking about, he was painting this great life that they were going to have together, and then when she's honest with him, he treats her as much like the trash as everyone else in town. So she was disappointed that she got that reaction out of him. But before they can get a chance to really delve into what they need to work out and where they stand and all of that, both Devon and Ethan find out that I don't know if I would call him a nemesis necessarily, but this guy they were in the POW camp with who was also in the, he's also in the military, and he wasn't really that well liked by the other guys in the troop, as far as what I can remember, compared to the other characters we get to know. Ethan and Devin both have plenty of stories about him before being captured, not being good to other people in the troop, but not being good to women he came in contact with. And they said, we even heard rumors of this guy being sexually aggressive or even attacking women. And it turns out that this guy that they have all these stories about, he has a history with both Lisbeth and Julianne. And when they start putting all the pieces together, when all four of them sit down and start sharing stories, Devin and Ethan realize this guy has to be stopped. He is much more of a terror than we even realized before, and we can't let any more people, especially women, be victimized. So the only solution is to hunt him down. So then there's a story of a manhunt that gets worked in this. So one of the reasons this ended up being my favorite is not only the handling the difficult topic of people making tough choices in tough circumstances, and addressing that theme of not being so quick to judge people because you don't know the choices they had to decide from. There's a lot of times when you look at somebody and you think, God, how could they do that to themselves? Or how could they go down that path? And you just don't know that maybe at that time, all of the choices they had, they were all crap. And they just had to pick the least crappy one. I know I myself have been in that position plenty of times where I just didn't have enough good opportunities presented in front of me. Even when I tried to make opportunities, so many times my life didn't line up the way I wanted to quite right, or I just wasn't in the right time at the right place, and I would see other people with fewer skills advance better than me, and they would turn around and judge me. But that you don't know, like, as far as life circumstances, schooling, health issues, financial issues, you don't know what people are battling day to day. So I think a lot of people are guilty of looking at others and saying, oh, how could they? So I do like that this story addresses that and shows in this very straightforward, solid character that she knew she was making a choice that nobody was going to really applaud her for, but you know what? It kept her alive at the time. So I appreciated the sort of gritty reality of that, and then also the characters were just better developed in this one overall. They felt more real than the other two books in the series. The plot itself was more interesting. You have, like I said, a lot of gritty, chewy topics that you get into, and then there's also scenes of manhunts, and just I don't know. Overall, it just held my interest way better. The story with Julianne, it brings up a lot of thoughts on empathy and putting yourself in someone else's shoes, and just in general, the plot just had more humor and depth. I mean, there was like a lot of humor especially between Ethan and Devin. I loved the friendship between them, because I think it's Ethan is the one, if I remember right, that comes from sort of the privileged background prior to going in the military. I forget, his family has some sort of plantation or timber business, I forget now, but they made their wealth out of some sort of industry thing, and they had enough wealth that the family could comfortably move through the war without too much strife. And then Ethan was expected to take up the family business. when he came back, but he found he preferred gambling a little bit more than than work. But there are times, I mean, for the most part, Ethan is pretty good, kind-hearted guy, but every once in a while there are scenes where he gets a little bit snobby. He looks at people and again, that whole like empathy thing, he forgets that he hasn't had the same struggles that a lot of people have had. And so he'll make a comment here or there where that will cut a little deep and be unfair. And Devin is there to sort of straighten him out and be like, dude, that's messed up. You don't know these people. Don't say that. And so I liked that they were there to sort of right each other and keep a balance, and also just like the jokes back and forth. And then there is also one scene in the book where they just completely go head to head because Ethan completely steps over the line regarding something in Devin's personal life that he doesn't agree with. And Devin is not afraid to tell him, you know what, you can go to hell. Like, because this is my life. I appreciate you, I respect you, but you can respectfully fuck off. And at first, you know, Ethan has his pride hurt and he goes storming off, and then he's like, no, he was right. I took it too far. So I don't know, there was just like a really cool bromance between them that I liked. Also, the bad guy in the story, I did note that he was a reasonable amount of evil without coming off as cartoonish. You know, it's like you don't read descriptions of him, picture like the curled up black waxed mustache going, it's like he was legitimately enough of a bad guy, enough to make your skin crawl, but like he was somebody you could picture actually existing. And then the only other thing I noted in here was that I struggled a little bit with Lizbeth's character because she could be very melodramatic sometimes. Even though I know in the story she was a victim of assault, it was a little bit exhausting when it was like all the time with just weepy or she would just have like weepy scenes or cryptic messages, the way she would talk to people, or she'd have this way of talking sometimes that reminded me of, it almost felt like, you know, those friends you have on Facebook that leave those comments that you know are fishing for sympathy or pity or just comments in general, where they'll leave something really vague, and then when you try to find out what's wrong with them, they're like, oh, message me, I don't want to talk. It's like, it kind of had that same feel to it sometimes with her drama, which, I don't know, that might strike people as insensitive, but I don't know, there was just something about her character where I'm just like, come on, like all the time with the hysterics, like, it's okay. So I struggled with her in the beginning, but that does tone down a little bit as you get further along in the story, and she never became one of my favorite characters, but she grew on me a little bit, at least enough to where I didn't totally hate her. So yeah, that's about it for that one. Another series down. Oh, I don't think I mentioned, as far as like, because this is also Christian fiction, I don't think I mentioned like the spirituality aspect. I think also in this one, it's also pretty light, if I remember right. I usually make a note if it's stronger, but everything I have in my notes here says it was all pretty light. If I remember correctly, I want to say this one was even lighter in the Christianity than the Chicago Fair books. I mean, it's pretty common with Christian fiction. If it's not in the story, let's see if they have one here. Yeah, you almost always have a Bible passage at the very beginning, like the quotation or you know, where they put like the inspiring quote by somebody. Like on this one, they have a quote by Robert E. Lee as well, but they also have like a Bible passage there. It's almost inevitable that that's going to be in there because, you know, I guess if you're published by a Christian author, whatever your story is about, it has to have the tie they're looking for, the overall feel of what that publisher is going for. You know, I think I mentioned in the other video, I review for a number of different companies, and some of them are Christian, and some of them do have certain styles that you can recognize. You can definitely see a difference in style between, say, like Thomas Nelson and Bethany House. Thomas Nelson, I've noticed, and I've been doing reviews for them for, gosh, probably 4 years now. And I think I've been doing Bethany House maybe 2 or 3, maybe longer, I can't remember. With Bethany House, one of the distinctions you can find is their covers are always a lot like glossier, slicker, a lot more photoshopped. It's a lot of like girls with wispy hair and pretty dresses, usually looking out to sea or something. I was gonna say this is a Bethany House, but this is actually Revel, which I think is actually done, it's Revel and Baker Publishing, I think is all like under the umbrella of Bethany House. But this is similar to what a lot of the Bethany House books look like, and if you can see that like glossy sheen. They have these like, they either do these where it's like almost humor style, or they do ones that are very dramatic and like usually a landscape with, like I said, flowing hair and flowing dresses and all of that. With Thomas Nelson, they seem to do the more matte finish. And I also noticed in the last couple years, Thomas Nelson is branching into a little bit more of the grittier themes as far as what they're publishing. Bethany House, I noticed everything, at least from what they've sent me, everything seems to usually gear towards the happy ending and everybody getting their way and God blessing everybody and all of that. With Thomas Nelson, some of their books, they might not be that strongly religiously geared at all. As far as, you know, that Bible passage just beginning might be the only honest marking you can find for it to be deemed Christian fiction. Otherwise it could be read as any book you pull off a shelf. And in the last couple of years, I've noticed the authors they're publishing, the plots are involving more and more themes like depression and suicide and self-harm and alcoholism and all of that like gritty stuff that I don't know if that's hardly ever come up in anything I've read through Bethany House. I think in Bethany House I've maybe read things that slightly tiptoe, maybe hint at someone being sexually assaulted, but it's always like very politely hinted around. I've noticed in Thomas Nelson books, you can have scenes where they just go full on at it and tell you exactly what the attack is like. So that's just like one variation I've noticed between the two. So yeah, when I do these series videos, they won't necessarily all be Christian fiction. I just happen to have a lot of series because I get sent them for review. But I do have plenty of secular series I'll be bringing up. I debated possibly bringing in like some sort of card that said, you know, whether this was Christian fiction or not, and if the Christianity was strong or not, putting that as like a cutaway card in the video. But I don't know, I feel like if I do that, that's like, it's almost like saying that's where my focus is going to be, and it's not necessarily that. I'm just really pulling books as a series, and the only reason I'm bringing up the religion or not is because I know some viewers don't want to read that at all. Some readers I know get really irritated if they pick up a book and they don't realize it's religious fiction, and they feel like duped into reading it or something. So and then I know other readers who don't mind it if it's light but don't want to read it if it's preachy. And then I know other readers who really want it to be preachy, otherwise they feel like it's cheating. Like, I know there are people that have their varying degrees of it, so that's the only reason I bring it up. It's so that you know what you're getting into before you pick up the books, if they sound interesting to you. So, I think I have rambled on enough. I've done, gosh, a few hours worth of filming. This will be fun to edit. Not in this video. Just collectively, I think I've done a few hours of filming today. So, yeah, I'm going to give my voice box a break. I'm going to give my foot a break and maybe rest a little bit before my husband comes home. I guess that's it. All I have for this one. And we will talk soon. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.